I'm gonna have you play this first slide, Roger. There's a YouTube video embedded in it. I'm gonna have you play it in a second, so you'll be ready to go. Yep, he's all set. In December, I was sharing with some of you some of the strange things that happened in my life. You know, I'm always engaging with ideas and blogging and reading things, and that's something that I've always done. And I came across some interesting stories from a Canadian psychologist who teaches psychology at the University of Toronto, and he had a lot of interesting things, and he was doing these biblical lectures, and he was selling out this concert hall in Toronto with these lectures about the Bible, and he didn't really know a lot about the Bible, didn't have any training in it. I thought, why is this guy selling out a concert hall talking about the Bible when there are plenty of empty pews in churches? So I started watching his videos, and I, like many, got hooked on these 2+ hour videos of him rambling about this and that. And I did some blogging about it, and then in December I thought, because I had already played around with YouTube with the cameras and stuff that I set up here, and so I thought, well, I'll make some YouTube videos about it. And then I made some YouTube videos, and my YouTube subscriber thing had 15 subscribers, most of them watching the Freddie and Paul show. And for years, since like 2006, I had 15 subscribers, and then I made a couple of videos, and a few days later, I had 300 subscribers, and then 600 subscribers, and then in a couple of weeks, I had 1,000 subscribers, and now there are around 4,300 subscribers. And it was strange. And then I began getting messages from people, emails and Facebook messages and Twitter messages and even some things in the mail. And what I had seen and what got me into this was that what had been happening around the messages of this man whose connection with Christianity is ambiguous at best, people started coming to me. And people started coming to me with their stories. And Alexander is one of the people I met, and in this crazy YouTube culture, people put up videos about themselves. And so Alexander started sending me messages, and I began conversing with him, and he began sharing his life with me. And last week, we tried to do a video together, but he was going to record it on his end, and there were technical problems, so we'll probably try it again at some point. But this is the introduction to his YouTube channel, and he talks a little bit about his life. So go ahead and play a little bit of it. We won't play the whole thing.
My name is Alexander. Welcome to my channel. I've been wanting to do this YouTube channel for a long time now. By the time that I was 18, I was in my first inpatient rehab. By the time I was 21, I was institutionalized for the first time in a psych ward for a suicide attempt. My adult life up until very recently has consisted of trying to stay sane and sober and trying all sorts of different psychotherapy programs, all kinds of different medications, in and out of psych wards and rehabs, trying to hold down jobs, trying to stay off the streets. I tried AA, I tried NA, I tried SMART programs, CBT, and I was put on so many different medications, ranging from antidepressants to antipsychotics to anxiety to mood stabilizers to, it's a pretty long list. But no matter how hard I tried any of these different programs, and I mean, a lot of them, I really tried hard. I was absolutely desperate, but for whatever reason, none of them gained any traction. And things continued to get worse in my life and in my head, and I began having more and more psychotic episodes. I had been diagnosed by the time I was 21 with bipolar disorder. But I had this pattern that emerged pretty early on, in my early 20s, and was pretty consistent. And I would wreck my life completely and completely reboot and have to move somewhere new, get a new job, and start over completely. And things would be going good for a little while, and then slowly but surely, I would begin to unravel. Things would get worse and worse and worse. I would stop taking care of myself. I would stop showering. I would stop brushing my teeth. I would stop cleaning my room and my house. And I would stop calling people, family and friends. I would start, isolating and just staying at home in my bed oftentimes. I would stop going to work, and I would just stay in bed for days or weeks on end and have depressive episodes that would last for months at a time. I would try to go back to school and work towards my education, my goals, but I could never keep my head above water, and pretty soon the chaos would overwhelm me. Things got so bad, they were pretty bad the whole time, but eventually I got so desperate that by the age of 25, 5 years ago or so now, I decided that I needed to do something extreme, and I quit everything and left the world, and I went and lived in a monastery, and I trained as a monk for about 3.5, 4 years. And that was when my life finally started to turn around for the better. It was hell getting there. I had one final bender that very nearly killed me. But once I had gotten there, it was miraculous. It was around that time where I really wanted to start this project and start documenting the process of self-transformation that I was attempting to undertake. But I kept putting it on the back burner. So I quit everything all at once when I went to the monastery. I quit drinking, I quit smoking, I quit doing drugs, I quit my psychiatric medication, I quit social media, got rid of my phone, I quit TV, entertainment, I quit everything, and just dived headfirst into this meditative practice and this spiritual communal living. And it absolutely saved my life and my soul.
And so actually Alex continues his story. The video goes about 10 minutes. And he was in the monastery and he thought, no, that wasn't his right path. And so he left the monastery. And sure enough, after he left the monastery, he went right back to the old things. And then he tried ayahuasca, which is like this herb, this shamanistic thing. And he had a vision with this herb. And the vision told him, go back to Christianity. And then he found Jordan Peterson and his biblical series. And then he found Jordan Peterson's videos, and he was watching his videos, and then he found my videos and started watching my videos, and then contacted me, and we've been in conversation since. And he's been, for a while now, he's been able to maintain sobriety and sanity, and I want to be really careful with stories like this. Because often in churches you'll hear stories like this and someone will say, oh, my life was a mess, and then I found Jesus, and now I don't drink anymore, and everything's been great. And I know people who have lived those stories, so I'm not going to say those stories don't happen and they're not true. But there's many other stories where things are great for a while and then they fall off and on and on and on and on. And that's very normal and human and real. But what was interesting was with his story is that one of the things that he needed to try to put together was he realized he needed to inhabit a much bigger, richer world. In his time in the monastery, the discipline of the monks could kind of hold him together. But without that external structure, he kind of receded back into it. And so what he's struggling with now is to live within the structure of the world. And so a lot of his seeking is, how does this world work? And a big part of how does this world work is, what story world do I inhabit? What do the things of this world mean? Are all of these things just stuff, or do they mean something? So the second, can we go to the next slide? There we go, thanks. Oh, I got to turn this on to have it work. A second story. So Alexander's the first story. Second story is, I'm not going to name his name, he's a very famous psychologist. born in towards the end of the 19th century, worked into the 20th century, died kind of mid-century. At the beginning of the 20th century, he was working in what was then called an asylum for people with mental illness. And all of the doctors told him, don't bother talking to any of the patients because they're all crazy. And it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of, and aren't we supposed to help them? And so he began talking to the patients that were crazy and began to listen to the fact that they all had stories, and their stories were embedded within a richer, fuller sense of story. And he began to notice that when he talked to patients about their stories, yeah, they had a lot of wild things to say, but over time with talking, some of the patients would get better. And of course, later on in the 20th century, this is what you do with a therapist. You sit and you talk it through. But what this professor realized, what this doctor realized, was that our individual stories have to be wedded to a bigger story. And if our individual little story isn't wedded to a bigger story, we get lost. And our lostness isn't just, oh, I don't feel real good today. We fall apart psychologically, and we do things that are destructive and unhealthy. And so this doctor then began to try to work his theories into much broader theories about saying our little stories have to connect up with big stories. And if there are problems with these stories, we don't do well. And have you ever noticed that so often it's the immigrants who come to this land from other cultures that are far more traditional who manage to have a work ethic and a family system. And in fact, often we say, well, you know, those folks coming up from Mexico, they do the jobs that Americans don't want to. Well, I think if you talk to a lot of the people hiring many of these immigrants working construction or in the farms or all of these other places, they're doing jobs that many Americans can't do. Because Americans don't have the kind of self-discipline and motivation. If in fact you go to Silicon Valley, one of the wealthiest, most successful places in America today, you'd be amazed how many of those corporations are run by immigrants. What does that say about our culture? Because one of the things our culture has done is, in a sense, stripped people of the deeper stories around them. You see, even though we're all individuals here and we're all human beings, I think in some ways we're like the Texas privets that are in my backyard. Now, some of you might know what these Texas privets are. They're these evergreen trees. They go everywhere. When I first moved here, it's like, oh, look at all these lovely trees. And some of them were going a little wild, so I thought, well, I'll just cut this down. Yeah. You cut it down and you realize, no, this thing that's above the ground, yeah, that's a tree, but this thing really isn't kind of like a tree because these roots go all underground and all of these plants are connected. Now, we're individuals and we don't have vines that tie each other, but the things that actually tie us together are cultures and stories. And the truth is, we can't live without these things. We need to live embedded in a rich, symbolic, metaphorical world. And I think that's why in American culture, the most popular movies, I've made this point in a number of sermons before, the most popular movies are mythological type stories. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Trek. And the true fans live into these stories. And I think the reason we do so is because, in a sense, what our culture has done is stripped us of story, and we've begun to learn that there's very little meaning in life if we're not embedded in a very rich story that gives us meaning and gives our lives purpose. Because here's the thing that our culture tells us that everyone else's choices are constructed except ours. Well, they're a Christian because they grew up in a Christian home, or they're a Muslim because they grew up in a Muslim home. Well, they think this because they're a man, or they think this because they're a woman. And we think that everybody else's ideas and thoughts and behaviors are attestable to all of these attributes of their life. But me, I choose my own destiny freely. Oh, I'm the only unconstructed one, and the rest of you are just following the dictates of your political party or your religious group? No, we're all embedded. We're all embedded. And we say, well, I want to determine my own life, so I'm going to be whoever I want to be. What I'd really love to be is a ballerina. You should laugh. I would make a horrible ballerina. Nobody would want to see me on stage. It's just true. Jamie Smith, who teaches at Calvin College, had an interesting Veritas Forum talk on YouTube about one of his more recent books, You Are What You Love, and he talks about a Russian movie that I haven't seen, but I'm going to have to look it up and watch it. It's called The Stalker, and the guy really isn't a stalker. Pete's a movie buff. Have you seen this movie, Pete? Yeah, it's about a guy, and he finds a writer and a professor, and the stalker is kind of more like a guide, and he's going to lead these two people to a place called the Zone. And in this zone, there's a room, and the promise of this room is that anyone who goes into this room will get exactly what you really want. And you think, that sounds great. I want to have what I really want. And so he leads these people to this room, and just when they're ready to go in the room, the people pause. Because they're self-aware enough to know, what if I don't really know what I really want? What if I won't like what I really want? And we have this all the time. People say, well, I want this, and then they get it, and they realize, no, I really didn't want that. I want this. And this is how we are. And so, in a sense, what our society does is says, well, there's no big story around me, so I can choose who I want to be, and I'll be who I alone decide to be. And what that often does is strip us down and make us victims of our own desires, of our own base impulses that get our attention, of our needs that draw us to despair, and so we drink, or boredom, and so we just play computer games all the time, or watch movies all the time, or what have you. And we're kind of stripped down and left to our own devices, and that's kind of where Alexander comes in. He's a rather extreme case, but there he is isolated, and everyone's like, you can be whoever you want to be, and we say, that's a horrible fate to give someone. How am I supposed to know what I want to be? We've been going through the story of these covenants. And the story of the Bible begins with heaven and earth. And God, in a sense, the earth is God's footstool. The earth is God's garden. And God puts the man and the woman in the garden and says, tend my garden. I've filled it with glory, but I want you to multiply the glory. And together, we're all going to enjoy each other. And you're going to enjoy me. But the man and the woman decide to take the garden in their own way, according to what they desire, and not what the owner of the garden desires. And instead of just killing the man and the woman for rebellion, he in a sense says, you want to take it in your own way? Okay. I'll give it to you. I won't bother you, but I'm going to limit your power. I'm not going to let you just kind of run away with the thing, because I have a pretty good idea where it's going to go. And in fact, it does go there. And the earth becomes so full of violence and selfishness that humanity is destroying themselves and destroying each other. And God looks down and says, this is too painful for me to watch. I've got to stop it. So I'm going to reflood the world. I'm going to, in a sense, flush it all out. But then he has a soft spot, which is the center of his problem. And he says, but I'll keep the very best man and his family alive, and I'll rescue him and the animals. And so then I'll give a covenant sign, a rainbow, so that every time it rains, they're not going to be afraid that I'm drowning the world again, but I'm going to do it as an agreement. So here's the deal. If you promise to stop killing each other, I'll let you eat the animals, but you must promise to respect them. And so here is the promise, and I'll put a rainbow in the sky. So, since Noah, we've stopped killing each other, right? The world is no longer a place of suffering and pain and violence anymore, right? No, we didn't keep our bargain. So with Noah's covenant, there's a respect for God's authorship over life, which we break. And then God starts again with this Abraham, and he says, let's see if Abraham can learn to trust. And Abraham does, because the climax of that story is Abraham and Isaac on a mountain, and God says, take this son that your whole life I've been promising this son, and you never believed I would give him to you, and then I gave him to you, and now I'm going to tell you to sacrifice him to me. It's horrible. And Abraham goes up to the mountain, and he's ready to lift the knife, and God says, stop! Now I know that you can trust. And there's a ram in the thicket. And the ram takes the place of the boy as the sacrifice. And circumcision becomes the covenant sign for the whole. But then, as if you read the book of Genesis, Israel goes into Egypt as a refuge from the great famine. But in Egypt, they become slaves of Egypt. And as the old slave preachers noted, Egypt gets into Israel. And God has to take Israel out of Egypt. And that's a lot harder to do in terms of their persons than in terms of their bodies. And so God sends down plagues so that Israel can go out and worship God in the wilderness. And eventually Pharaoh has to let them go. And then God takes them into the wilderness, and it's going to be a time of training and purification. The wilderness, which is chaos, a place that can't support life, and God gives them manna to eat. And hopefully they begin to learn to trust him. That's what all of that is for. And God says, I want to make of you a small miniature model of what the people around you can see is my desire for the world. So Jesus' prayer in the Sermon on the Mount is God's mission for Israel. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But that's a really tricky thing, because they're going to have to somehow embody God's desire for the world, but they're going to have to do it in the midst of a broken world, and it can't be so extreme. It can't be cultureless, so it's got to be kind of close to the culture of the area, but also represent who God is. And you don't want any communication problems, and so God decides, I'm going to come down myself in a way that helps you understand within your cultural frame of reference exactly who I am, and I'm going to tell you myself. So on the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, and everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. Smoke billowed up like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children of the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Pay attention to hear how long he has to take to talk about the first 4 commandments and how fast he can go through the last 6. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And now come the rest. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, or his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain of smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die." And for any of you that imagine, well, I don't want to just have a preacher talk to me. I want God to show up. Be very, very careful with that request, because every time he does, people never want it. Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." That doesn't work. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. And so traditionally what you have are these two tables of the law. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And as we had earlier in the service, Jesus takes this up and says, here they are. Love the Lord your God. And this is all very new stuff, very different from the nations around. The first table of the law. The second table of the law was very similar to all the nations around. And so God, in a sense, takes them and says, here, I'm going to give you a template. And then the rest of the book of Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus, and Deuteronomy that most of you don't want to read through because they're really hard to read through, God basically shapes a culture and embeds Israel in a rich culture that's supposed to teach them how to be his people, so that they can embody the presence of God. So, and then in the book of Deuteronomy, he says, and if you follow this, you will live. You will have a rich cultural frame of reference that will bring justice into the land, so that there will be no poor among you, where people won't be oppressed, where life on earth can be as God wills in heaven, but within this Bronze Age cultural milieu. And I'd like to say that it all went well, but actually it doesn't. Like the other covenants, Israel fails. She doesn't keep the covenant. She is violent. She can't trust. Israel can't inhabit the rich culture God gives her. And so, of course, God sends Jesus. And Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, is himself new Israel. Why? Because Jesus will fulfill what Israel could not. Jesus is a prophet. Because what he says is, the way of Egypt, the way of empire, the imagination that somehow if we arrange everything right between us, we can fix our stuff. Jesus says no. Or if we imagine, well, there's oppressors over here and oppressed over there, and if we give the oppressed power, then the world will be great. Well, we've seen this movie thousands of times. When you give the oppressed power, what do they become? The oppressors. And we keep doing it to each other. Different people, same story. And so Jesus comes, and Jesus embodies this, and Jesus walks into it. And people are like, Jesus, why don't you take power over us? And Jesus says, I want to show you my power. But what do we want to do? Just like at Sinai, we want to shut Jesus up. The children of Israel had no means to quell the fire on the mountain, but that man who came vulnerable in flesh, we know how to quiet people. First we argue with them, then we marginalize them, and then we kill them. That's how to quiet people. And so Jesus becomes the priest, the final sacrifice in place of all the other animals that have taken our place for us. And then he becomes the king, the ruler who will give us a rich, contextual world in which to dwell. After World War I, before World War I, Europe thought, we've got science, we've got technology. We know what makes bad people. Bad people make bad people. So instead of killing the bad people, we're going to sterilize them all. And we're going to build a better human race. That's called eugenics. It was very popular at the end of the 19th and early of the 20th century. Because, hey, that's where you get, if you let smart people multiply, you get more smart people, and everything will be better. And so these fabulous ideas at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century all collapse in the First World War. When we learned, with all of our science and technology, you know what we got really good at? Killing each other. And so after World War I, Europe went into a funk. And soldiers came back from World War I and became nihilists. They didn't believe in God anymore. They didn't believe in stories anymore. But two soldiers from the trenches came out of World War I, and because nobody else was writing the stories they wanted to hear, started writing their own stories. And those two writers are J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Eric Remarque predicted a generation of men, broken, burned out, rootless, and without hope. Civilian life, he said, would bring no comfort to the survivors. We will not be able to find our way anymore. And when I read that, I think about Alexander's story and his struggles. After returning from England from the front, Tolkien and Lewis might easily have joined the ranks of the rootless and disbelieving. Instead, they became convinced there was only one truth, one singular event that could help the weary and brokenhearted find their way home: the return of the King. The King is stronger than that hideous strength that roams Narnia and Middle-earth looking for victims to devour. He is the archetype of the heroic in every culture and every age. He is the source of all goodness and courage, the desire of the nations. He comes to restore the long-lost days of freedom. This King alone knows the way that the blessed realm lies beyond the sea. The light ahead is growing stronger, wrote Lewis in The Last Battle. Lucy saw that a great series of many-colored cliffs led up in front of them like a giant staircase. And then she forgot everything else, because Aslan himself was coming, leaping down from cliff to cliff like a living cataract of power and beauty. This King comes with power and beauty, as the voice of conscience and the source of consolation, as the Lion and the Lamb. Here, perhaps, the lingering influence of George MacDonald. Loving kindness beams from every line of his face, he wrote in The Noble Knight of Fantastes. Even so, the knight's face grew stern and determined, all but fierce, as his eyes burned on like a holy sacrifice, uplifted on a granite rock. What Lewis discovered and came to embrace in MacDonald's vision was a union of tenderness and severity. On the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. This union of tenderness and severity. And he said, "This is my body, broken for you." You know how this world works? This world works saying, you're my enemy, you're going to pay, and I'm going to profit. And Jesus comes to us and says, I'm going to pay, and you're going to profit. This is the King we've been looking for. And you might say, well, the world's still a mess. Yes, it is. But what we do here in the church is we believe the King is coming back. The King will return. And all the sad things of this world will be untrue. So why are we eating and drinking at this table? We do so in remembrance of him. Because when we eat and we drink, we proclaim the Lord's coming until we see him again in his resurrected flesh. So if you believe this, if you say, I am with the King, then this meal is for you. He gives it to you freely. He is the living water. He is the river of life. He is the bread that was broken. Take, eat, remember, and believe that the great King gave his life for the forgiveness of all your sins. This world has always known that blood tells. We say blood is thicker than water. Jesus comes and says, if anyone's blood is going to be shed, it's going to be mine. Whenever you drink this, remember me. blood is thicker than water. Take, drink, remember and believe that the great King gave his life, was raised from the dead, and will return and make all your sadnesses come untrue. Would you stand? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you his peace. Amen.